Hi everyone, welcome to this Transport Planning Day event. Thank you for joining us this evening. I can see that quite a few people are joining. We'll maybe just give a minute or so just for a few more to join the session. But just quickly to introduce myself, I'm Nicola Kane. I'm Head of Strategic Planning, Insight and Innovation at Transport for Greater Manchester. And we're really pleased to be hosting this session this evening. Snappy title, New Advances in Assistive Technology and Independent Mobility. And we're going to cover quite a bit of varied ground this evening around that theme. And I'm really pleased to have a selection of speakers. I'm going to do a short introduction, and then we have Ellie Woodridge from the Connected Places Catapult talking about inclusive and ethical research practice. We have Phil Ellis from Beryl Bikes, about to go live in Greater Manchester. So good to have you with us this evening, Phil. And Sam Lee and Sarah Kameta, who are from our innovation team at TFGM, and are going to be talking about some of the projects we've been working on, which have direct or indirect potential around helping to create a more inclusive transport system. So we've got quite a lot to get through, but I'm hoping that we'll have a reasonable amount of time at the end for a panel discussion. So please do drop any questions or comments into the chat bar through the session. I'll do my best to monitor that closely, and we may be able to answer questions as we go on in a few cases, but I'll try and keep most of the discussion for the end of the session. And I suspect we won't keep you till 8. I suspect we'll be finished a little bit before that, to give you a bit of your evening left. So how are we doing now for attendees? Looks like we've got about 12 on the call. Brogan, do you think we should kick off?
Yeah, let's kick off.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I've just got a little bit of introduction just in terms of Greater Manchester and some of the issues and challenges we're facing around transport and social inclusion. So if you could move us on, Sam, to the first slide. So this is the vision that's set out in our Greater Manchester strategy, and it's to make Greater Manchester one of the best places in the world to grow up, get on and grow old. And I think that's a great place to start in terms of this evening, and why it's so important that our transport system helps everybody in Greater Manchester live their lives, and that it is an inclusive transport system that helps everybody to fulfil their potential. And so from that high level vision in the Greater Manchester strategy, we've developed a long-term transport strategy, which you can find on our website if you want to go and have a closer look. But that sets out a vision through to 2040 for a more inclusive transport system that helps to protect our environment, that supports sustainable growth, and that we do that in a way that's where we're embracing innovation. So very apt for this evening's session. We can move on to the next slide, Sam. At the core of that vision is an aim to create a much more sustainable transport network. So we have this ambition to reduce car use to no more than 50% of daily trips, with the rest of the trips made by public transport, walking and cycling. And when you look at the growth that's planned in Greater Manchester, that means we need to be catering for at least 1 million more trips every day on our sustainable roads. And we need to make sure that those trips are available to everybody, regardless of their mobility abilities. So moving on to the next slide, Sam. In our transport strategy, we have these what we call network principles, 7 principles which we apply to everything we do around transport. And one of those core principles is around inclusion, and trying to create a transport system that's more affordable, that is available to everybody, that is physically accessible for people with a range of different mobility impairments, as well as able-bodied people. And in particular, we've been developing an approach which we call Streets for All, which is a new way of designing streets much more people focused, and that very much has inclusion at its heart. If we can move on to the next slide. just to say that inclusion and tackling inequalities is an extremely high priority, not just within transport, but across all policy areas in Greater Manchester. And we recently commissioned this report, an independent report into inequalities in Greater Manchester, which highlighted a whole range of issues where different groups are excluded from opportunities for a whole host of reasons, whether that's through disability, through income, through ethnic background, and it's highlighted a whole range of areas where both the public and private sector can take action to reduce inequalities. And that report is very much driving action across the public sector at the moment to really look at the different inequalities that exist in Greater Manchester and how we can work together to tackle those. If we move on to the next slide, there's a whole range of issues. It's a really complex area which we'll only be able to skirt across through this evening's session. But from the different travel needs of women, we know, for example, from our travel diary surveys in Greater Manchester, women are much more likely to have complex journeys, performing a number of different trip purposes within one journey. So we know that women have very particular travel needs. We know that people with different disabilities have very specific needs, and they vary enormously depending on what those disabilities are. So we need to be really aware of that. We've done a lot of work with our disability design reference group to help to make sure our infrastructure is well designed for people with different mobility impairments. And ethnicity is also a big determinant of people's opportunities, and also also tends to lead to different travel patterns. And of course, age, and we'll touch on this later in the session in terms of designing our transport infrastructure for people of all ages. So you may have seen Andy Burnham. He's been pretty vocal in the local and the national press around his desire to create a much more integrated and sustainable transport system, which we call the B network. And here's some images of what that could look like in the future, with our existing Metrolink system being supported by improved bus services, low emission buses, and also new forms of shared mobility, including our bike car scheme, which we'll be talking about shortly. And just a very quick plug for our innovation team. We've got colleagues from our innovation team speaking at the end of the session tonight. We're currently working on an innovation prospectus, which sets out our priorities for the future. And we're looking at how inclusion really is a kind of central theme through all of those big areas of activity. So health, well-being and wellness is a kind of core theme that we're looking at, and obviously that has a major impact on inclusion. We're looking at things like the sharing economy and how can we make sure that new forms of shared mobility are open to everybody. Sam, sorry, could you go back to the previous slide? Sam will talk a little bit later about how we're using artificial intelligence to help us to plan a more inclusive infrastructure, and of course connecting people and vehicles can give us new opportunities for looking at how our transport system works for everybody. And the final theme is around the future of energy, which is linked to carbon. So probably less of an inclusion one in that one, but the other four certainly. There are a whole range of opportunities for new and innovative ways of working and new technologies to help us to be more inclusive. So I'm going to wrap up now with a short set of video clips from our disability design reference group, really just to give a little bit of food for thought in terms of some of the issues that people with different disabilities and mobility impairments have when using the transport system. So Sam, I don't know if you're able to play that video.
My name's Andy Walker. I'm the very proud facilitator, which means the chairman of the Disability Design Reference Group for Transport for Greater Manchester. We call it the DDRG. The first thing I want to say is that we've got a tremendous public transport network, and I'm very proud to be part of helping to develop that. I've had a lot of amazing positive experiences, so through my company and some of the roles that I pick up to support disability groups, I travel from Manchester all around the country. I think that some of the customer service, the wayfinding on websites has improved significantly in the last 15 years. Ramped access, level access for me is a big thing. Some of the areas that I'd like to see it improve is around people's attitudes around disability. That can be people working and understanding how to approach people with a disability in a wheelchair. That's from a customer service point of view, and finding it sometimes difficult to liaise and speak to me rather than my carers and my PAs, understanding that I'm the person maybe with the issue, the opportunity to speak to. It's also how you're spoken to. Speak to me like a human being. I know I'm in a wheelchair, but it doesn't mean that I'm back at kindergarten. I need to be spoken to like a child.
Hello, my name's Deborah. Well, yeah, I do struggle with using public transport, and I find a lot of things difficult, like with my autism and my mental health problems. I find, you know, if a bus or a tram or a train or something is crowded, I feel really panicked. I feel difficulty over, like, you know, announcements, not knowing where to go, you know, like not understanding signs.
Hello, my name's Frank. I'm totally blind, and this is my guide dog Ronnie. One of the biggest problems when you are blind is, first of all, finding a button to open the doors. Getting on and off a train, it is basically okay as long as you're familiar with the station that you're using. Some of the very large stations, let's say Manchester Victoria, which I use quite a lot, they background noise sometimes is off-putting.
Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a member of the DDRG. I use the buses most often where I live. There aren't trams and there are a few trains. On the bus, or with the bus, I find my main problem is getting the bus to stop in the first place. I've had a lot of trouble with missing lectures at uni, being late for work, because a bus hasn't stopped. Even with my white cane, even sometimes because I have some sight, I can spot the bus coming and stick my arm out, like, you know, so that no one can say, well, you've got to put your arm out for the bus to stop. Even when I do that, I've had buses speed past me. In train stations, again, I think there should be someplace fairly obvious, and by obvious I mean to me, who can't see very well, where to get your information from, where can you go in the station to find staff help you get to your platform, you know, help, whatever kind of help you need. It's not always easy if you're in.
Oh, we seem to have lost the connection. Sam, are you still there? It's going so well. Okay, whilst we're waiting for that to come back on screen, I think that we're almost at the end of that video. We've got a quick question for everybody. You don't get away with just sitting quietly and watching. If everybody could log into menti.com, I'll drop a code into the chat bar. We've got a single question for you to answer. Oh, Sam's back. If you could go to menti.com. Oh, you're right, Sam. And type in that code. We'd just like to get a sense of what people think are the most important aspects that we should be focusing on to make the transport system more inclusive. I think you get up to three options. So if you could quickly fill that in, and we'll take a look at what people's views are, and then we'll get into the first main presentation of the evening. Hopefully people's answers will start appearing shortly. Is everyone able to get into that? I'm hoping it's working. Maybe a slight delay. Ah, brilliant. Words are starting to appear. Kinder people, I like that one. Yeah, lots of different stuff coming up now. So we've got a bit of on technology information, pavements, important, yeah, debt-free, access into stations. Sam, should we keep that open and maybe just come and have a quick look at the end of the session, just to give people a bit more time to add their thoughts? So I'm going to move us on now, technology permitting, to Ellie, who's from the Human Insights team at the Connected Places Catapult. And Ellie's been working with us on one of the projects we're going to talk about later in the session, and we found her guidance and experience on doing insight-led research really invaluable in the work that we've been doing in Greater Manchester. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Ellie, and I shall hand over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. Thank you, Sam. So yes, the Human Insights team lead at Connected Places, and had met the team through the Accessibility Trig funded by the Department of Transport, which is a project currently looking to support innovation to make the transport sector much more inclusive. You're ready for the next slide, Sam. So what do we mean by inclusive design and practice? I'll start with one of the most commonly referenced definitions, which was presented by the BSI, which is that the design of mainstream products and or services that are accessible to and usable by as many people as reasonably possible, on a global basis, in a wide variety of situations, and to the greatest extent possible, without the need for special adaptation or specialised design. So further to this, I'd like to present a pyramid which illustrates, again, the inclusive design approach. So within this pyramid, the bottom segment represents those with no difficulties. So that's, this data is based on a Microsoft survey from 2003. That's a well-established model, and just 21% experience no difficulties. As we move up the pyramid, we see the severity of difficulty increases. And as you can see, actually, most of the population experience some difficulty interacting with products and services across their day-to-day life. So inclusive design aims to extend the target market to include those who are less able, while accepting that specialised solutions may be required to satisfy the needs of those at the top of the pyramid. So we still look to provide solutions, some of which might be more tailored. But if we have a portfolio of products or services across the marketplace, we hopefully can support all. I also wanted to mention the social model of disability that suggested, it's all right, Sam, the social model of disability that suggests that we design the world around us to make us disabled. So therefore, I think we all have a key part to play in creating a world where we don't disable ourselves. Often when we talk about inclusivity, we also talk about equality and equity. There are other common terms we might mention. I think that this is a nice representation, which is illustrating that three people of different heights all have a common goal to see what's going on the other side of the fence. So in a world where we're equal, the assumption is that everyone benefits from the same support and we all receive equal treatment. Sometimes when we talk about being inclusive, we say that we want to feel equal to others, but perhaps we need to understand more about what that means. And that maybe we just want to access at that same goal. So equity looks at how we can give everyone the support that they need that's specific to them. And then further to that is justice. So the end picture shows that all three can see through the fence without support or accommodation. This also reminds me a bit of the social model of disability, where we've actually designed a world that fits the purpose and meets the needs of those three individuals. So let's think about why we might not feel included and how our capabilities vary and how this might lead to exclusion. So our capabilities constantly vary based on the context. For some individuals, they may live with long-term disability, and for others, it could just last for 10 minutes. As I talk through these potential experiences and the diversity, I'd like you to consider if you or someone you know has experienced something similar. So have you ever tried to manage many items across the transport system, like this lady here with all the many shopping bags? Have you considered or experiencing travel with physical disability, or journeyed considering the needs of yourselves and others? If you look at the picture at the top right, I'm really not quite sure how many businesses today could cater for that many bodies, never mind all those people. And then some disabilities are hidden, which has a magnitude of concerns and issues as to how we might feel that we're treated around this. Sometimes cost is the barrier in our ability to access something. And also our cultural needs are not always catered for or respected. Thinking about diversity, we might be treated as a minority due to our ethnicity, our gender, age, and sometimes this is all due to lack of understanding. But it can stem through this physical world, the systems, the workforce, and other passengers, and this can all cause us to feel excluded in different scenarios and different points of our life. You can go to the next slide, please. So I think something we really need to consider at the minute is the digital age that we're moving into. So we're becoming ever reliant on technology and looking at ways as to how this can solve our problems. And it certainly can make our life more flexible in the interactions that we have with the transport systems. And it can also enable us to be more connected. I mean, there's really great examples of how technology is providing assistance and support to many, and that will be presented today later on in the presentation. However, I'd really like to echo that it's really important to be mindful that not all users are able or willing to interact with digital services. This is quite a nice infographic which highlights that 10 million people in the UK lack digital skills. These individuals come from different backgrounds and a range in age. And the reasons for not interacting with digital include cost, not having the right equipment, not perceiving a need to use, or finding it too complicated. And if you could go to the next slide, please, Sam. I also wanted to mention another threat that we can face through design through AI. So Goss Consultancies, they actually shared this with us on the accessibility trig as well. That artificial intelligence it not only replicates human biases, it confers on these biases a kind of scientific credibility. It makes it seem that these predictions and judgments have an objective status. So I felt that this was a really powerful statement, and it really emphasises how through the design of AI, we could further emphasise the potential for exclusion. Almost feeling that there is a science and that's the norm, we'll create more norms that could create further divide. So I think it's really, really important that we remain open, work together across diverse groups as we work on enabling digital to support ourselves. So I hope that's provided a bit of an introduction about inclusive design and why we should consider it. But if thinking about your own experience and others isn't enough, here are some other key reasons. So at the moment, we're perhaps not meeting the whole market needs. So these are just two examples and it doesn't cover everything. So the purple pound represents disability and the silver grey pound represents the aged population. And that's about 274 billion or 320 billion. But actually there's some potential people that want to access different services and we're just not meeting the needs of that market. It's always much cheaper to design in at the beginning. Retrofitting costs a lot of money. It causes a lot of stress. So again, I would really emphasise that you think about the wider needs right from the beginning. Particularly for public transport, it's a legal requirement. There's more advocacy for groups now to go to court. The Equality Act enforces the support that everyone deserves, really. So obviously that's a key driver, which I hope gives you incentive. And then, as I mentioned, a better life for all, including yourself. So if we design to make something inclusive, or design with sort of more extremes, or those that are having more difficulty, then actually we can provide better experiences for everyone. And yeah. So at the moment, a report stated this year that transport providers also lose £42 million a month by not being accessible. So I think that's think how much we could use that money to provide better experiences, and support everyone. So thinking about ourselves and the influence that we have to design better systems for all. Here's another pyramid. Again, it points out that a designer maybe has a better user ability and feels more included currently, if we think about the current transport systems today. And actually, there's quite a lot of people that aren't being considered here, and the green shows the shades of exclusion. So again, we might be sitting at our desks away from the context, not really understanding the needs, capabilities and the lives of a diverse population. So it's really important that we start to consider that. You can move to the next slide, please, Sam. So I've always been an advocate of the Inclusive Design Toolkit and their concept design process. So it starts off with the explore section. First of all, we should think about the needs of our population that we're serving and who we could potentially serve, and really understand the problems from their perspective. We might have an assumption to date of a problem and want to quickly solutionize it, but it's really, really important to go out and really understand the needs of others. We then should work together as a community. So again, a diverse group of designers, stakeholders, work together to come up with ideas, solutions and next steps. So we might start to create what that could look like, and then bring back, review together, all working together, and then also evaluate that again with real people to ensure that we've actually met their needs. It moves around in a cyclic process because this process is quite iterative. Lots of the tests and trialing can be done relatively low, and then you might move into larger studies. But yeah, definitely the need to sort of keep coming back in and working with users. We can go to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk to you about a few tools which might help to broaden your horizons and consider the different perspectives and experiences of others. So these are some examples of empathy tools that are simulating physical disabilities. So the picture of the lady on the left, she's wearing some goggles to simulate partial sight loss, and then also using some gloves which are manipulating her ability to use her hands and her dexterity. To the right is the third age suit, which was developed by Ford. So the Ford Focus of that time was the most accessible vehicle. Most people didn't realise, and they developed this suit to look at the mobility, movement and physical abilities to move in and out and use the car, and really did have some impact of doing that. I think these tools are really useful in design and to open our eyes to think more broadly about the experience of others, but these are our experiences of trying them. We are not the same as other individuals. We're all different. We all think differently. If you have a disability, you're likely to have habituated around it and have your own coping mechanism. So it's not okay to do your design just with these tools, but they are good in terms of opening your perspectives to the different ways that many people might interact physically. You can move to the next slide. Again, I think looking at personas and user profiles are good tools to share around your teams to think about the different perspective of others. The Cards of Humanity was a game that Inclusively shared with me last week that they developed. So you can go on the website and think about different people and then also their different needs if you deal a new pair. And it's quite a nice way to think about your solutions and just go through lots of different users and think how might they interact with that. To the right is a persona which illustrates users who are experiencing dementia, which was used to look at sort of improving the design of homes for those with dementia. So I quite like the use of this one, that they've considered the caregiver in the relationship as well with the persona, and they've also looked at good, average and bad days. So I think that's important to think about, is that we might experience things in different ways at different times. And also I think what's really important with personas is that we think about that everyone has their own hobbies and interests, and that's really important when we design for experience. So we should include those as well, not just think about capability. We can move to the next slide, please. So something that you can use the personas or considering different profiles is when you start to solutionize ideas or interventions which might enable people to get past their problems. So the first one on the left is a features wheel, and I've put the links on the side so you can read more about these tools as well. But you can suggest a change and think about the first order consequence, the second order and the third, and also the ethical playbook to the right, which is a decision tree that we could do this, what could be the positive impact and what could be the negative. So these are great tools to do as a group, because again, you're bringing in lots of perspectives and to think about how that might impact the wider population. And also when we put one intervention into the wider system, how does that work with everything else in the system? Can we still achieve what we have aimed to do? Sam, if you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So again, I have talked a lot about physical capability. Obviously, we've talked about inclusion as being much wider. But here again, from the Inclusive Design Toolkit, there's actually calculators online, so you can estimate the proportion of the British population who may be unable to use a product or a service because of the demands that it places on their capabilities. And this can be a bit of a helpful sense check to look at really what impact you are making or not as well. So I'd really like to emphasise after all that you still need to do research with real people. Christine from Open Inclusion, she shared this on LinkedIn the other day that someone had wrote on Twitter. So he said, I don't blindfold myself to test tactile maps we design. It's utterly pointless. I pay blind people and visually impaired people to test them and talk about what they understand. It's much more than vision loss. So I think that is a really, really important point, and it goes back to her mention that we are all individuals. We know we have habitualized in our own ways. So it's so important to go out and speak to end users. So if you can move to the next slide. Thank you. So my advice is to work with people often throughout the design cycle. Try not to assume, as I mentioned earlier, really go out and explore the needs, and what might be a problem to you might be perceived differently to someone else. Really just listen lots and keep listening. Ask people how to best work with them to capture their insights and to evaluate your services with them. Obviously, if they're feeling comfortable, you're probably going to get much more out of the research. So just be open and ask what works for everyone. Consider working with those considered as extreme groups or minorities. One, their voice might not be heard, so it might not already be in our design guidelines or best practice. If they are having real difficulties or severe difficulty and you can address their needs, then you're likely to address the needs of the wider population. Utilise expert services. So please make use of all the great user research, inclusive research services. They've got years of experience of practice. They know how to do the research in the right way, and they can work with you, provide support and training, and you'll just get the best outputs really working this way. They have access to panels of lots of diverse people. And also, it's just really important to pay people for good work and their time, and for the participants that are supporting. So definitely using expert services can enable you to do that in the effective way as well. So net zero is obviously very big on the agenda at the moment. I always think when something is driving such force, you can kind of piggyback on that. So I think it's a real drive that how can we make net zero inclusive and work with net zero to make this the new norm as everything starts to become normal and net zero going forwards. Thank you, Sam. And then, but perhaps not like this. So really important to think about the end-to-end journeys and the places we need to be. So the Israeli minister could not attend COP26 on Monday because her wheelchair, it was not wheelchair accessible. But I think this was on the journey travelling to the event. And sort of the response was that they're deeply frustrated and the venue is designed to be accessible for all. I think saying that as well, again, you need to be completely open and understand you might have thought that you had designed something inclusively, but you never know. Everyone has different experiences. So again, keep your ears open or keep listening. Learn from others and keep adapting to make a better experience for all. So thank you, Sam. Oh yeah, and this is actually my colleague shared with you this morning, the virtual circle of inclusion. So sorry, it's not very clear, but it's a nice takeaway to think about the ethos. So first of all, inclusion allows me to know other ways of being in the world. And when divergent views meet, create collaborative innovation as a result, which enables me and the organisation to learn and grow. So I increasingly seek out and embrace difference to create environments of inclusion, which allows me to know other ways of being in the world. So I think that's a nice way to think about your approach to the world and the work that you do. Thank you.
That's brilliant, Ellie. What a fantastic introduction. It's got me thinking about all sorts of things. So I'm looking forward to having a bit more of a chat with you about some of your ideas. And I can see John Carr's put a question in there about testing with real people and how important that is, not just disability, but ethnicity, parents, even pale and stales like me. So yeah, it'd be great if we can perhaps come back to that in the conversation. And I'm also I'm with you on the net zero and inclusion. We have to find an inclusive way of meeting net zero, and I think if we don't, we'll come up probably with the wrong solutions to the problem. So yeah, perhaps we can also pick up on that in the panel discussion. So thank you very much, Ellie. That was a brilliant introduction. I'm going to move us on straight away to Phil Ellis, who's the CEO of Beryl, who's going to talk about their work on inclusion. And I think, Phil, you're going to talk a little bit about forthcoming launch of your bike hire scheme in Greater Manchester, which would be good to hear a bit more about. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks, Nicola. Yeah, also I'd echo what you said. That was a brilliant presentation from Ellie as well. Really has got me thinking. So what I thought I'd do is I will introduce a little bit just quickly about Beryl and micromobility in case people aren't fully aware of what it is, and then I'll dive into a little more about the Transport for Greater Manchester cycle hire scheme that we're launching and some of the specific proposal and ideas within that. And then I'll sort of cast an eye forward to both our approach to sort of future developments and some sort of thoughts on the industry at large as to how we create more sustainable and inclusive systems. So first of all, so Beryl, we're the UK's largest micro-mobility company. We're about 120 people. We operate micro-mobility systems all over the country. We have about 10,000 connected vehicles. The vehicles are either bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, e-cargo bikes, and really micro-mobility is anything that is electric or human-powered mode of transport that normally sits somewhere below public transport, but in the sort of in the transport investments and transport strategies of a city. So as you can see, yeah, we operate across the country. As I say, we operate bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, and e-cargo bikes now. So we support cities in two ways. We either run the micro-mobility system in its entirety, or we partner with cities where we are selling our platform and some of our services to be introduced under a managed service contract. And that is how the system is going to be operated in Greater Manchester, where we are the manufacturer of the bikes and the parking stations where people will dock their bikes. We've developed all of the technology for how people will access the bikes and pay for the bikes. And we'll also be providing all of the on-street service and the workshop maintenance for the delivery of the bikes, all under a contract which is managed and governed by Transport for Greater Manchester. I guess just a sort of a starting point for micromobility, I just wanted to pull out some really top-level stats just to sort of sharpen my mind, I suppose, when thinking about these sorts of things. You know, a really simple one on gender balance. So for us, something interesting has happened over the course of the last 12 months. About 12 months ago, we had about a 48% split male to female. Well, there's a slightly more female customers using our services. But over the course of the last 12 months, that's actually got worse, and got worse quite substantially, to the effect that we're now got 58% of all of our customers identify as male and 38% identify as female. So, I mean, there's some specific things within there that we can perhaps attribute to that. For example, we have many, many more customers making journeys on electric scooters, which does skew towards younger males. And that has had an impact overall on the accessibility, on the inclusion of our systems. And I guess, yeah, it's a very sort of striking and easy one for us to sort of sharpen our minds to straight away. And another one that I just wanted to include here, you know, without wanting to throw too many stats, which start to lose meaning. Actually, 10% of our customers, so 10% of the people who are riding our bikes or e-bikes or scooters or whatever else it is, have a disability. And so that's actually a you know, for a mode of transport that people might not normally associate with people who have a disability, physical, mental, or otherwise. There is actually 10% of our customers already identify as having a disability. So there's already customers who we can improve for, and there's of course a whole load of other customers who we haven't yet managed to bring into the service. So just to speak specifically about the Greater Manchester scheme, so there's a few different approaches that we've taken to the scheme. So first of all, the scheme covers a really dense area of central Manchester going into Trafford and Salford as well. So there's the regional centre of Greater Manchester. And the thing that we've tried to do here is implement a really dense network across this region. And we've tried to make it accessible, first of all, by proximity. So by making sure that there are a sufficient number of stations where people can drop off and pick up their bike, so that people are no more than 400 or 300 meters ideally from a station. And that is regardless of where you are living or working within the town and city. So We've covered, the whole area across various locations, regardless of indices of multiple deprivation and regardless of the types of users that we think we're going to be appealing to use the scheme. And of course, yeah, as I say, within 300 meters, we know that there's a direct correlation between the density of a station network and the number of journeys, the utilization that you will get of every bike every day. And so that's really the big effort that we will have over the course of the next 7 or 8 months as we move towards the mobilization and full launch of the scheme in early summer next year, is actually going out and deploying all of these stations across what is, in some places, very dense city streets with limited carriageway and limited pavement space where we have to do that. And of course, across private landowners, public landowners, and heritage areas and all sorts of things. I don't know if you can still see the slides, but for me, they've disappeared. But I can pull up my PowerPoint and carry on and just assume
Yeah, they've disappeared for me too.
Okay.
We're back.
That's
We're
back. Yeah. Great. So yeah, I mean that's really kind of a simple one to start off with. And I guess the next few things we have tried to take a few specific interventions. As I say, there's already a good number of customers who are using our services, and I think that's another thing to remember about cycling and e-bikes and e-scooters as they come through, is these modes of transport are often more accessible than you might first think. And probably preaching to the choir on this one in terms of people who have selected to come along to this talk, but it does nonetheless bear repeating that cycling and now especially with electric assisted modes of transport, this is actually a more accessible mode than people think, and very simple things through consultation and discussion with different disability groups. So, for example, the Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People advised that something as simple as creating additional space and a hatched area and a docking station just slightly aside from all of the others within a row can help people to get on the electric bike or the bike, just in an extremely logical way of providing additional space for those with mobility issues to easily maneuver and access the bike. So there's really simple interventions like that we can do. And continuing with sort of slightly more, I suppose, nuanced types of approaches that we've implemented into the bikes, the cycle hire system that we're implementing in Greater Manchester is the stations themselves. So we'll be implementing we'll be implementing 40 mini parklets or active mobility hubs, as we call them. So what we're trying to implement here on the street is not just a row of docking stations, a row of metal that secure the bikes, but an opportunity. Of course, we have to do a little bit of that to deliver the security of the bikes on the stands, but trying to add a little bit more utility to the street space. So adding in some planting, adding in some additional signage, adding in some seating, so that there's an opportunity to overall enhance the street space from a healthy streets perspective, but also provide a bit more utility to the infrastructure that's going in, providing a place for people to stop and rest, and a place, hopefully, for people who might otherwise just see a row of bikes and not think it's of any benefit to them or the city, but potentially see something that adds a little more utility to the space. And beyond that, it's about where we want to be putting the stations in, working very closely with the constituent districts and working with Transport for Greater Manchester to try to make sure that these stations are going in two ways, really. As little as possible in any way that's going to be restricting pavement access, and always where there is any pavement stations going in with sufficient, really obvious things like sufficient 2.1 meter at least space either side, but really trying to focus in on carriageway space and converting carriageway space into parking stations. And that's a big focus, and that requires a lot of effort for what's going on. And it also actually opens up the opportunity for us to use the stations as, and this may be slightly ahead of my pay grade as the supplier, but trying to maybe use these as modal filters and create a few areas that can really shift space into from some car journeys into active mobility journeys. Finally, so not finally, I should say, but a big one is on the bike itself. As I said, actually more accessible than people often think outside of the industry. The bike itself is designed to be quite light, maneuverable, easy to access. Of course, the electric bike provides a great deal of additional accessibility and utility, particularly for those who are a little older. We know from the customers that we have on our existing e-bikes and surveys that we do of existing customers that e-bikes do appeal more to people at the older of an older age, and so it's great to be introducing 20% of the fleet will be e-bikes. But simple things like a simple step through design of the bike, having the bike as light as it can really be for a bike share bike, and including things like baskets both at the front and the back on the rear on the e-bike to allow people to basically normalize cycling, to bring in the activity and the behavior of jumping on a bike as something that's part of their day-to-day routine and not something that requires too much specific planning in advance. Millions of theses will have been written and will continue to be written, rightly so, on digital tools and what needs to be thought about in terms of creating accessible digital tools. This is a digital first scheme. The bike share system will mainly be accessed via smartphone apps, and that comes with a massive array of considerations, and things like the inclusive design toolkit is really important, as well as sort of standards that have been recommended from governmental organizations about how to think about the digital tools and accessibility. So that's something that's thought about and something that we continue to build into the design process. But I suppose beyond that, we also have built in a few different mechanisms to make sure that more people can access the bike. So there's two strands, I guess, just to pick on a couple. One is providing a mechanism through which people can access the bike without having a smartphone. So there is an SMS unlocking feature. So whether that's for people who either can't afford or simply don't want to have a smartphone, you can access the bike through an SMS unlock. And secondly, and maybe not represented in the photographs here, is providing access to the bike share system for those who don't have a bank account. So facilitating payment through third-party payment gateways, whether that's things like PayPoint that's already integrated through the TFGM retail offerings, or being able to top up cash cards through TFGM retail outlets. And sort of casting an eye forward, the example perhaps, the best example is perhaps from Transport for West Midlands, where operating on the same technology system, people can access the bike share system through the mobility credit scheme. And of course, those who benefit from the mobility credit scheme could be anybody that has been targeted by the local authority for reasons of behavior change and wanting modal shift, or for reasons of accessibility and inclusion, perhaps trying to help people who are otherwise not able to access transport to access it more equally. And so we have we've been able to introduce changes to the payment gateway that allows for simple mobility credit schemes to provide access to the schemes. So then, there's a little bit of detail there on Greater Manchester scheme, and obviously the opportunity to fire in some questions, because there's both things I haven't spoken about, and I'd also say things that we haven't included that perhaps I haven't thought about. And I guess the whole point for me of coming to sessions like this and speaking with colleagues such as yourselves is to recognise that this is an area that we need to continue, both as a company, as an industry, to learn in and benefit from. And so what I'm bringing forward here are a few examples from ourselves and from others within the industry of other innovations that people are introducing to help with the inclusiveness of micromobility. I think micromobility, it really does have an opportunity to substantially and fundamentally improve the health and sustainability of our cities. and I do really believe that, and will advocate for that. But as a new industry and as a highly rapidly evolving industry and a highly competitive industry, really for us to sort of, achieve that promise, we have to work hard to make sure that we're constantly challenging ourselves to make sure our systems are as inclusive as possible. So just a couple of examples that innovation within this industry is facilitating. For those who are perhaps familiar with bike share systems, traditionally, 10 years ago, a bike share system will have been introduced with a fixed docking station that provided the locking and the connectivity. And what you were left with then was the bike that had to nest into that dock, and effectively a dumb bike and a smart dock. What the industry has done is really transferred all of the technology onto the vehicle itself. And so the street space is sort of agnostic to what mode you are docking or parking or locking or whatever else it is in that space. And so what this, with the emergence of IoT technology, gives ourselves and other companies the opportunity to do is introduce things like this connected electric wheelchair that was on the screen just a moment ago, whereby we can simply connect it to our back-end systems and make it accessible via the same operating system, and even have it app accessible. And then there's additional things that we've been doing more recently. In London, for example, we have a cargo bike system launching there. Now, cargo bikes, there was a slide earlier with, what's the level of the lack of accessibility of a scheme, and sometimes a cargo bike can help with people who are, unable to move large amounts of things that they want to move and might otherwise be able to on a micro-mobility system. Cargo bikes can also help facilitate parents. There's a question actually in there, wasn't there? Parents can, with the right cargo bike, even do the school run, and perhaps you've seen that happening. And again, it's that transition of technology onto the mode and away from the dock that allows us to more rapidly roll out off-the-shelf vehicles, off-the-shelf products that other parties might have developed, and being able to implement them into our system as part of a cohesive micromobility system is part of what we're doing. And finally, in the background of that photo, you'll see a big hangar. And so even where that last bit isn't possible, through an app-based digital service, 24/7 self-service system, we can implement, and we have implemented in London, these big hangars rather, that can take unusual sort of types of mode of transport and keep them secure and keep them in a way that allows people to access them 24/7. So whether that is a wheelchair or a cargo bike or whatever else might come next, whatever the next innovation is, we want to try and have a system that can incorporate that quite easily. And whether it's something that our local authority customers identify, whether it's something that the industry identifies, or whether it's something that we identify, we want to basically try to give ourselves the platform through which we can implement those things more easily. And I guess similar to Ellie's last point here, I guess I do want to talk about. I wanted to talk about sort of inclusivity through our operations in the broader context. There's a few different things going on, both locally in the Greater Manchester scheme and within the industry and within our other schemes. So, we have a zero emission operation in Greater Manchester for our on-street services. So it's all delivered by cargo bike redistribution and cargo bike maintenance teams, or electric van teams working on street overnight. To create hopefully a link that is obvious to people. It is often the poorest in society who are most adversely impacted by poor air quality. And so we have to work hard to make sure that while we are implementing a system which is directly aimed at making a more sustainable city, there's no reason why it can't be a shining light for city centre logistics and zero emission operations. And secondly, and maybe a slightly more nuanced point than but not important nonetheless, I think these systems and the systems that we're implementing elsewhere create new jobs, and they create new roles in what are emerging and growing industries. So we're able to recruit. I guess this is a plug because we are recruiting right now. So if anybody knows any talent that we can bring on board, then we're recruiting a whole host of roles. We have brought on a number of roles across the country from Universal Credit, where we train them to become bike mechanics and work in connected vehicle based smart city systems. And so it's building up quite a good skill set of in growing industries. And we work with the Growth Company in Greater Manchester, and we'll continue to try to recruit through some of the welfare to work programs that they operate. And then I suppose the last point from me, was just to talk about micromobility in general. I wanted to touch on the UK's Department for Transport e-scooter trials that are going on at the moment. Greater Manchester are taking part in these in Salford and Rochdale, and we're taking part in them in other parts of the country. And I suppose just wanted to take the opportunity to flag that this is another area of emerging transport policy where inclusion needs to be thought of, and we continue to think of it. What we'll see is the DFT sharing an interim report at some point in this month on the impact of the trials that have been running for over a year now. And so there's a few key questions in there for me. It's a note to myself as much as anything, but just gives you a bit of a window into the sorts of things that we're thinking about with this is driving licenses. So currently all legal shared e-scooter systems in the country, people need to have a driving license to access them. That was a legal requirement as part of the way that e-scooters have been deployed on street, but it does open up questions around inclusivity if that rule persists, whether people don't have a driving license because they choose not to, whether people don't have a driving license because it's not affordable to them. We can't be excluding certain groups of people for that reason. Keeping an eye on future legislation in terms of whether the sharing systems are going to remain, whether private scooters are going to be allowed. And I guess just thinking now, this is a mode of transport innovation within our industry, within micromobility, that appeals to a wide group of customer groups. And how do we make that as broad as possible? So perhaps not only for those who have access to sharing systems, but for people who want to have private ownership of scooters, and whether there's a necessity to think about the enhanced inclusivity of the mode outside of sharing systems. So a couple of things that I'll be looking at with the e-scooter rules that are changing, which is a highly charged political and interesting area of micromobility at the moment. Thank you very much.
That's great, Phil. Covered a lot of ground there, and actually that's opened my eyes to some of the kind of range of issues and opportunities, I suppose, around micromobility and inclusion. So again, it'd be good to get into some more discussion about some of the thoughts you've shared in your presentation. So thank you very much for that. And do drop in any questions into the chat bar. I can see a few starting to come through around how we charge for transport, and whether we start to set fares on the basis of societal costs potentially, and also kind of what opportunities we might have to challenge the view that cycling is only for trendy middle class men and the last thing that poor people want to be doing. So yeah, great if we can come back to some of those questions in the panel discussion shortly. So thank you, Phil. I'm going to move us straight on to our last presentation, which is a double act from Sam Lee and Sarah Cometa, who are part of the innovation team at Transport for Greater Manchester, who are going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of the projects we've been working on over recent months that either directly or indirectly present a whole range of opportunities around making the transport system more inclusive. So I'll hand over to you, Sam and Sarah, I think for about 20 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time for some discussion.
Great. Sarah, are you okay on your audio?
Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me?
Right, great. Thank you, Nicola, and thank you from all the previous speakers. Really insightful stuff. What we're going to do in this section is quickly cover a number of key areas around what are the opportunity with technology for us to better understand movement and design from an inclusivity perspective. what are the roles of kind of innovative and actually immersive technology to help us for future design. Sarah will talk a little bit about some of the applied innovation we looked at for a specific ATRIG project, and then we'll tie it up very much around the area around digital inclusion and social prescription, you know, in terms of future opportunities. So I'll jump straight into it, and hopefully we can get through this quite quickly. So within the innovation team, we work on a number of different innovation projects to really understand what the real opportunities are for the organization as a whole, kind of moving forward. So one of the areas we've been looking at during COVID is how do we understand kind of movement differently, and we were really lucky to work with an external company called Humanizing Autonomy through an Innovate UK funded project to look at the role of AI can play in terms of understanding movement within interchange. Now, this was specifically used on CCTV footage to really understand social distancing within the interchange kind of mindset, and actually the project opened up kind of different thinking within the organization of what the different CCTV footages can be used for, what impact it could have on their future station design, as well as potential things around wayfinding and other areas as a whole. From a design perspective, it changes the way people think about where CCTV potentially should go as well, because of these new data sets we're collecting through this project. I think the two key things I want to touch on within this is around how the solution is used to provide a GDPR compliant set of data for us to understand movement without compromising people's privacy as a whole. And we got a lot of we started implementing different changes as well, actually, throughout COVID in terms of cordoning off certain entrance, one-way exits, entrance and exit, to test and understand the behavior when we do applied interventions as a whole. And as you can imagine, that's a hugely powerful tool when you start thinking around designing for inclusivity and designing for people with different needs as a whole. So imagine a computer vision kind of solution that can identify people, wheelchair users potentially, and draw out the trajectories and the path they use from getting from the entrance of the station all the way through to getting to the public transport. Imagine you can start identifying partially sighted people and understanding behaviors of where they would potentially get stuck, or potential line of sight blockers, you know, where tactile paving might not be at the right place, or it might just be people crowding around a specific area that traditionally, from a design perspective, we didn't consider. So this sort of technologies is now starting to allow us to get more enriched data out of existing CC footages, and helping us looking at design in a more inclusive and a more holistic way. So that's kind of one area around looking at how we capture data for using AI and then kind of existing solutions as a whole. But what about design? I think we're all aware that traditionally a lot of the design are done on paper and CAD plans, but it's very hard to really understand and more difficult to even really test some of these solutions before we implement them as a whole. So one of the previous projects we worked on as part of a smart city demonstration is to explore with actually a final year university student the role of VR that can play in terms of implementing and designing new cycling infrastructure or new kind of civil infrastructure as a whole. So I'm just going to quickly switch to play a video. By the power of technology, this should work as a whole. I'm going to play this.
That allows you to cycle through a virtual here in Manchester.
Yeah, so this was actually just a project idea from a university student for the final year project. And you can
take point cloud scans, we can take photogrammetry, we can take 3D models.
And you can see that you can take into different data sets to start helping us design the infrastructure in a different way. And what that actually means is that the solution, sorry, let me just switch back. The solution actually can be used from a consultation activity point of view, or really understanding how a person will cycle down a particular piece of infrastructure. So the solution itself of actually been adopted by big consultants like Arab, which now they're using and trying to sell as a product as part of the consultation activity. I'm just going to play one more video in terms of how it's transitioned from that little idea from a university student to a real kind of applied solutions on the ground for one of the B network scheme, which is around Chapel Street. And this was actually used for a consultation process. But with this sort of technology, what you can start doing is testing the infrastructure and how cyclist behavior, how the cyclist would behave with specific incidents. So imagine a partially sighted person trying to cross the road, while a bike is approaching. How would the cyclist interact, with that partially sighted person? How do we change the design so that that consideration is made so that cyclist is not going too quick at specific crossings? Or it might be very much around a wheelchair access point of view. How would the cyclists interact if there was a number of wheelchair users or other micromobilities, as kind of Philip talked about on the cycle lane? It opens up a huge range of opportunities to really test and kind of start on getting additional insight on how the solution would be interacted with before you even built the solution as a whole. So now I'm going to hand over to Sarah Kmeta to talk a little bit about the A-Trig project and kind of how we've used technology to try and help people travel more independently and more confidently. So Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Hi, everyone. So as Sam mentioned, I'd like to talk through a project that we're working on currently. So this is very much something that we're working on in our day-to-day work. With the project should finish at the end of this year. So must caveat saying we don't have all the findings, but it's definitely something that I wanted to share with you today. So as what I thought I'd start this part of the presentation around was all around the challenge. So the DFT has got targeted ambitions around how transport should be for people that do have a disability. They aim for the transport to be accessible to everyone, that they're able to travel easily, confidently, and without any extra cost. And this allows disabled people to have access to the transport network to meet friends and family, travel for work, and undertake leisure activities so they can contribute to society and the economy. With this challenge in mind, the team at TFGM did a bit of research into the problem more widely, and I just thought I'd include some quotes at the bottom here, which kind of bring the challenge to life a bit more. So the one from Scope UK is 40% of disabled people experience issues or difficulties when travelling by train in the UK. And then a particular challenge that we found across a number of bits of our research was all around how assistance is great, but it usually needs to be booked in advance. It relies on the ability of station staff being available and being able to help the person. And because of this, it removes an element of personal control and therefore spontaneity of a journey. With that in mind as well, we've worked very closely with a charity called Henshaws, which is a Manchester-based sight loss charity. And they told us that people just want to travel with confidence and independence. And that's something that we really, these different bits of insight we pulled together to come up with a bid that we were successful in gaining. So what was the solution? We worked with USmartThing and SiteCall on this, but this is essentially what we came up with. So USmartThing have a established journey planning application. So we combined this with SiteCall's technology, where they can get feeds from the end user's phone, and then this gets sent to a call center. So what we did is we combined the two technologies. So someone will be traveling through Greater Manchester. They can plan their journey ahead of time through the planning app, the planning tool. And then once they have their journey planned and they are going along, if they need any assistance at any point during their time using the public transport, they can click on an Assist Me button. What this then does is request information from the person's mobile phone and sends a feed directly to the call centre team that are based in the TFGM offices. What that allows is a clear audio and visual guidance from an expert that's trained in how to deal with the passenger, so any issues that they may have. And they have also got real-time information at their fingertips, because they can see exactly the journey that the person is aiming to complete, and also where they are currently live on the journey, so they can assist them. I should caveat by saying, obviously we're focusing on sight loss for this project. So Android and Apple have really quite established voiceover technology, and this solution works with that voiceover. So the Assist Me function and the journey mapping all can be accessed through that voiceover technology. So that's the technology. It's essentially using the person's phone as a pair of additional eyes, and then a user that's got access to different forms of information can give them tailored journey advice. So that's the idea, but why do we think this is important? We think the project has quite a local and also national impact, because it aims to benefit, as we said, like the end user by making public transport more accessible and removing some of those associated complexities that people with disabilities face. But also, we think that it's important because it provides improved information. As I mentioned, it's real-time information, but also personalised data that's direct from the user's smartphone. So it's not just generic assistance, it's actually tailored to the end user. As well, we've worked, as I mentioned, with Henshaws quite closely with this, and we've put the needs of the traveller at the heart of the solution development. So we've gone through different rounds of testing, and we've involved them throughout that, so we can have their input into the solution design. As well, we think, well, we know we've focused on sight loss for this particular trial, but as we've developed it, we think that there's quite a big opportunity for this to help with people that potentially are older and need more assistance potentially through their journey, or even just a range of other characteristics, such as people that maybe with autism, dementia, or those that are just anxious when using public transport. We also found Henshaws said that this solution could be particularly helpful because it leverages existing technology. There's not a need for anything other than what most people have, which is a smartphone. And that again gives an element of freedom to the person, just to, if in an event of needing some assistance, they can just dial up and be reassured that they would have someone on the end of the phone that can help them. And Henshaw shared a useful stat that 70% of people that do have some form of sight loss do have a smartphone. So it's quite an accessible way to help people. Just go on to the next slide, please, Sam. So what was our approach? I just thought I'd include this because it was something that was recommended by Henshaws, and it allowed us to ensure that we kind of put ourselves as the people that were developing the solution, and also our call centre operatives in the shoes of the people that would be actually using the solution potentially. So Henshaws helped us lead a workshop with our call centre teams, and the intention of this is similar to what Ellie mentioned. So you can see that's actually myself in the middle, but I've got glasses on that mimic different like sight conditions. So Michael on the right hand picture there is completely blind with those glasses on. And what we did is we used a solution and also tools and guidance that Henshaws had given us in terms of the best way to communicate with people who do have a sight impairment, and practice using the solution and these tools to guide ourselves around Manchester Piccadilly. We know from our call centre teams that this is something that they found really valuable. They said that it's, you know, they help lots of people every day, but to actually put themselves in the shoes of how the person might be feeling and what they have to deal with, they said that it really helped them understand how the best way to communicate with them is when they do receive a call through the tool. So I just thought I'd share that because it was something that we thought was really insightful. Going to the next slide. So what have our key learnings been to date, and what are the next steps? So we actually then did a trial with some people that do have sight impairments through the help with Henshaws, and they indicated that it was a really helpful solution, especially in times of disruption. A lot of them said, you know, even though I've got a sight impairment, I think we'd use public transport all the time. But the only problems that we face are usually when there's disruption. So when things change, platforms change, or my route's been disrupted in any way, that's when I need extra reassurance. The technology worked really well when we were testing it in a quieter environment. We found, especially in Manchester Piccadilly, as it's such a busy train station, sound quality, because the person was holding the phone away from them, was a bit of an issue. It often meant that the call centre operative could hear the person, but the person using the solution couldn't hear them. So that was a particular challenge of the solution. As well, the technology relies on the user giving a clear view through their camera phone. And sometimes it meant that the way that they were holding their phone didn't necessarily give the person in the call centre the best view of what they were facing. So again, that proved sometimes quite challenging. And at times, the call centre operatives, even though they'd been trained in the best way to speak to the end user, because of the sound quality and sometimes the poor visual feed, it meant that they sometimes felt compromised in regards to the information that they could provide. And then there was concerns around safety in that aspect. And finally, when we trialled it in some of the more open spaces, it worked really well. But like all things, as you know, when we were trialling it in Piccadilly Station, there's the part where you go down towards the Metrolink is partially underground, and that meant that the connection sometimes cut out, which meant, again, there was a risk of someone being left without any information. So as I said, we've not finished this project yet. We've got a couple of more months on this to really get as much leverage as we can from it. So our next steps, we want to do a second round of user testing just to really understand those pain points in more detail and understand how we might overcome them. But I think our real next opportunity with this is to understand the role of wearable technology. So I mentioned that one of our key aims of this project was to utilise existing technology, so smartphones that most people have. But it's clear that there's a bit of a gap between where we want to be in the assistance that we can provide, but what the technology allows because of the environmental impacts that we have. And as a team, we think that wearable tech will probably become more mainstream in the future. So we've got two images there. One's a Google Glass, which looks very futuristic, and I don't know whether it's something that you would necessarily want to wear that often. But the Ray-Ban version is a lot more accessible, and potentially would become more mainstream in the next few years. So we want to understand whether there's an appetite for people that do require extra assistance to utilise that sort of technology, and it's definitely something that we would like to test as part of this project. So yeah, watch this space. That's it. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Sarah. So there's just, as kind of Sarah touched on, there's a lot of kind of innovative solutions that are kind of let down specifically by the technology that hasn't quite caught up yet. And actually through a lot of these projects, we're learning a huge amount of, actually, is it a process gap or is it actually a technology gap? So the two areas just going to quickly touch on now is around kind of how do we support kind of this emerging agenda around kind of healthy aging as a whole. And actually what's really interesting is these are some statistics from the TFGM Insight team has captured during the pandemic around behavior for 50 to 70 around active travel. As you can see, during the lockdown period, there was definitely increased likelihood of walking and cycling within the kind of key groups that kind of Phil touched on around female cyclists, and kind of the aging population as well. And I think the pandemic has created a unique opportunity for us to make some of the behavior stick as a whole. So one of the things we're starting to look at is what are the role of active travel in terms of ensuring that we encourage the over 50s to be more active and utilizing active travel as the key kind of connector to connect them to services, as well as maintaining their kind of personal well-being and fitness as a whole. This is a slide that's extracted from my age-friendly workshop that was held by the Combined Authority, and it covers some of the key areas that we're looking at in terms of that age-friendly design for active travel for the over 50, and areas we want to kind of look at moving forward as a whole around kind of how do we change the cultural aspect of it? Is there a specific piece around kind of policy that we should be considering around physical environments, kind of linking back into Phil's point about infrastructure design? How do we make sure they're designed in that right way? And the thing I kind of want to touch on this evening is around kind of organization and institutions, and actually what the roles in terms of the NHS and the health trust could play potentially in this sort of area. So currently within the innovation team, we're exploring what that could look like by looking at social prescription that currently exists in the Greater Manchester ecosystem through a partner called Elemental, where they already used 8 out of the 10 NHS trusts already use this system to social prescribe people with different needs to specific services and kind of activities within the area they live in. And this is just kind of a high level overview in terms of what that journey looks like. But one of the key things to date we identified is that there is not that much around active travel or kind of cycling provision within that social prescription agenda. And actually we feel there may be an opportunity here to really understand what that looks like. And a lot of the solution right now, it feels very kind of unuser friendly, where, as you can see from this picture, the provider, the social prescription sends an email to the person that running the gardening club, and that person then needs to ring the person in order to encourage them to come along. There isn't that consideration of how are they actually going to get there? How do we ensure that we can encourage them to use active travel and public transport as a combined offering to get to these services and sites? So through the project we're exploring is to start to look at what are the roles of some sort of bike scheme could have on activating cycling, and actually linking that to that multimodal piece, as I mentioned, because a lot of the aging population have access to a concessionary pass. So how do we maximize, the utilization of that as a whole? And on the other side, what are the roles of technology for us to better understand how they move around? There's a number of smart sensor companies out there now that can capture insight in a qualitative way on what route the person take with their journey. With accelerometers in the devices, we can capture safety related data such as near misses and potentially even infrastructure condition. So could we use this kind of component to help us understand the condition of our assets, the B network that we're building, and kind of you get feedback at the same time as activating cycling in the aging population as a whole. And I think the thing that I want to kind of conclude with in kind of my deck is around kind of thinking about transport in that holistic way. I think as professionals, we sometimes fall into the trap of thinking about the modes in their isolation and not necessarily around that holistic and the wider picture as a whole from an inclusion perspective. And the core key things I want to kind of touch on this evening is around digital inclusion. As Ali's kind of slide touched on, which I was going to show, but I can't anymore, around the different areas and the different gaps we have on this. And, this is something that the combined authority is looking at. So imagine this environment where increasingly council services are going to be online and digital. Do people have the right skills to access those services? The same applies for our transport system, as Phil showcased, if it's a digital first proposition, how do you ensure, people can access those solutions without, necessarily all the traditional digital solutions? The bankless kind of offering is also another key piece. I think on the other side, when we think about inclusion, I think the pandemic has highlighted that one of the key tools we could potentially use to achieve some of our decarbonisation and green targets is actually not traveling and connecting remotely. Obviously, there's other challenges associated with that, but facilitating that requires this connectivity piece to be linked. So what are the considerations we need to start making in terms of digital connectivity and access to that connectivity in order to access services and employment and council services, as kind of touched on? So the combined authority is looking at this in kind of different pillars, and is looking at things such as how that could be used to empower kind of different people, how technology and digital can help us innovate on our public services without excluding people. So that how do we tackle the bankless challenges? One of the key areas that we touched on this evening as a whole. And there's that aspect of how do we make sure no one is left behind, technology as an enabler rather than something to replace existing services as a whole. And I'll close with this kind of final quote from Andy Burnham in terms of the time is coming. Digital connectivity needs to be a basic human right, because it potentially could exclude so many people from different services and opportunities in the GM region. And as transport professionals, we need to consider that in a more holistic way. How do people access the next generation e-scooters, charging infrastructure? Actually, how do they even fill out a form to get a concessionary pass? What are the digital provisions that we need to consider, and the connectivity we need to tie into that? Nicola.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam and Sarah. It's an awful lot to get our teeth into there. Hopefully we've done a good job at showcasing a range of exciting projects we've been working on in Greater Manchester. It'd be good to hear about any others that are going on around the country, or indeed internationally. I can see we've got quite a few international participants on the call today. Very keen for others to participate in the Q&A. We'll just spend about 10-15 minutes just kind of picking up some of the key themes from the presentations. So if people do have questions, do please drop them into the chat bar. I can see there's quite a few there about how we make cycling more inclusive, attract more diverse people to cycling. So I will come back to that question. But I think one of the themes that's probably quite relevant for Transport Planning Day is the role of the designer, and I know Ellie, in fact, if everyone is able to switch on their cameras, that would be brilliant so we can see you all. I know Ellie, you touched on the fact that we don't necessarily, the people who are designing these systems don't necessarily represent the diversity of users. And Phil, you talked about trying to attract more diverse workforce into your business. Have you got any thoughts about how we do that in practice? And Sarah and Sam, if you've got any thoughts on attracting more diverse people into transport planning as a profession, that would be brilliant. But maybe if we start with Ellie, I don't know if you've given this much thought.
Sorry, took a while to unmute them. So we actually did a project on the future of skills last year. And I think the big one is actually still going into schools, that there seems to be a loss of that career path, that we do events in schools, that people get excited about the difference that they can make. And then as that path sort of moves into secondary school, it kind of drops off all through university. So I think maybe more mentors with younger years from different backgrounds, and approaching different schools. Obviously that's more for the future. So I think doing events like this, or just getting out there and mixing more, makes people realise that there are opportunities and that this career is quite exciting.
Brilliant, thanks Ellie. Phil, did you want to pick up on that theme?
I guess this doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do the right thing, but I think as an organisation, we basically would try to make the organisation reflect the communities in which we serve. That's a sort of simple thing that we should be doing, or all organisations should be doing, regardless of the products that you make or the services that you deliver. But I think as a company that do make products and deliver services, I think it's doubly important that internally we reflect the communities that we serve. And then I think sort of beyond that, having, I guess, this creating this sort of the resource and the space and the budget and the time and the necessity for those who are working most directly on the products and delivery to sort of, I guess, get into understanding the people that they're designing services for. and I guess the way that we would try to do that is, as an organization, we have the opportunity to partner with TFGM, who have people such as Sarah and Sam who are thinking about this, all the time. And so what we need to be doing, what I need to be doing after this phone call, is making sure we're learning from all of the work that goes on there, so that we're bringing that into our constant evolutionary process of design and for product and service. And I think that goes to that sort of links to my earlier point on general sort of desire that we have to find partners to collaborate with, whether they're customers or whether they're competitors from the industry. And I think sort of a natural predisposition towards collaborating in that way is gonna help as well.
Great, thank you, Phil. And I don't know, Sam and Sarah, whether you want to comment on the kind of projects that you've been involved with as part of the innovation team, and how those kind of partnerships with different user groups, with different SME partners, innovation providers, transport operators, has enabled us to develop solutions that hopefully help to support a more diverse range of needs. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Sarah, ladies first.
I was just going to say that I think the way that the funding calls work, it kind of gives us a bit of time, which sometimes, everyone's, projects sometimes can be a little time poor, or you're under pressure. But I think it allowed us to explore needs as a starting point, which was quite a great opportunity for us. And we made sure that we had charities involved from the start, so we were going from that as a starting point rather than kind of developing a solution and then trying to retrofit so the insight into that, so make sure it fits people afterwards. So I definitely think that approach of using insight from the start and then kind of going through a cycle of testing whether it still met the end user's needs throughout the process has been really helpful, because it just allowed us to make changes throughout, rather than getting to a solution and then thinking, oh, okay, what do we need to do now to make sure it fits the needs of the XYZ people. We kind of used it as a starting place and then build blocks around that. So yeah, that was really helpful for us.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Just want to pick up, actually, there's a question in the chat bar from John Carr about digital devices and bikes being beyond the budgets of the people who most in need of assistance that modern tech can bring to the affluent. Phil, I know you had some thoughts on this, and you were talking about how you can use kind of non-smartphone technology, for example, to access the bikes. Do you want to just talk a little bit more about that? Because I do think shared transport offers a lot of opportunities for people to access solutions without having to own them. But it'd be great to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, in terms of the cycles themselves, the modes, whether it's a bike or an electric scooter or an electric cargo bike, absolutely. For me, sharing systems are a big sort of, you could see them as a giant like behavior change projects in some way. Like, there's nothing better than when we hear of people who used the bikes once or twice out of curiosity, and then either sort of committed to membership options or whatever made it affordable for them, that then meant they use it more frequently, or actually went and bought their own bike. And notwithstanding John's point, bikes are actually, an owned bike is, probably the most affordable way you can get around. If you can buy a safe functioning bike, and if you use it every day, it is a very efficient way of getting around economically, environmentally, and every other way. I think that part of it is the gateway drug. That was the point I was also making, actually, about e-scooters. There's a lot of people who are riding private e-scooters right now, and that is illegal, but they're riding them because it's cheaper than getting the train or getting the bus or drive, or it's quicker, than those options. And for whatever reason, those people have chosen or decided that cycling isn't for them. Like, cycling has been there as an option, and people haven't chosen not to do it. And organisations such as myself will continue to try to break down the barriers to cycling, but nonetheless, there are some that are there. And so again, that's a whole asset class that we should be, I think can offer a whole other group of people the opportunity to move around more sustainably. And then, yeah, more specifically on the sort of digital devices, I suppose the point of the question there referring to smartphones and things like that. I don't know, there's a couple of things to say. I think one, smartphone use is pretty highly dominant. I think on our most recent surveys, most recent sort of demographics research that we read, it was sort of like 92% or 96%, something like that. So it goes a long way, but it leaves a gap. But it's not necessarily means that, like, a digital kiosk for hiring a bike or a digital kiosk for getting a bus ticket or a train ticket and things like that are equally bring a different set of challenges, and sometimes more a more harder to reach challenge. So I think within the work that we do, that's what I suppose why I have to acknowledge the limitations of a digital first system, create the gap, create specific solutions where there are identifiable gaps, and then continue to collaborate, as I say, with people such as Sarah and Sam to continually find the next improvement that we need to make. Oculus unlocking e-bikes, for example.
Brilliant. Don't give Sam ideas like that. He'll go crazy. Ellie, I just want to come back to one of your points you made in your presentation. I think someone picked it up in the chat bar as well, about sort of factoring in the cost of inclusive design, and also in getting different user groups involved in the design. And there is a cost associated with that. Have you got any thoughts about how we properly build that into the design process? I suppose it's a bit like designing low carbon infrastructure as well, isn't it? There might be some more cost up front, but you hopefully save money down the line. Have you given any sort of practical thought to how we build those costs in better and when we're setting budgets for things?
Yeah, so I think it does just cost money. That's what I have to say, even all the time to bids, and actually same with grants. We're trying to do more of an educational piece that please allow partners. I know they suggest that X amount of partners should be on a bid, and they don't like to have lots of subcontract, but we've actually been talking about how it's really important that actually the subcontract is used to bring in expert agencies to allow us to access participants or work with charities. I mentioned in this slide that doing good research up front is cheaper in the long run. So again, you have to invest that cost. But yeah, I don't have the answer. All I have to sort of say, sorry, we need to spend the money to do the research right and get our foundations right. But obviously you need to have the investment up front to do that.
Can I just jump in a little bit here on kind of Ali's point?
Please do.
I think there is a lot of data sets out there that actually could help us answer the questions. I think the challenge comes back to how to get access to it as a whole. I'm sure Phil's got a wealth of knowledge actually from the schemes in Birmingham and other places that actually, generates insight that we may not have considered, as a whole. So I think coming back to Ali's point around that wider partnership working, that's why we're keen on working with SMEs and kind of external partners and kind of other local authorities as well to understand what doesn't work. I think we traditionally have a culture of not willing to talk about the failings, but actually those are the most important lessons to share kind of as a whole through these kind of processes and kind of activities, and actually reaching out to partners that we may not traditionally consider that have that insight. So just a high level example, it might be engaging with someone like Visa to understand movement by contactless taps from someone that have accessibility needs, for example, not something we would consider traditionally as a transport planner, but actually provides us the insights and the data we need.
I was gonna add to Sam's point, if that's okay, and say that I think a positive move has actually been the collaboration across the transport sector with large tech firms and small tech firms, because actually we are sharing that experience across both sectors. And I think, yeah, more working with different sectors and sharing the stories, as you mentioned, Sam, and with those experts, I think, does it still apply in this context, is really valuable.
Great, thank you, Ellie. I can see that there's a bit of a debate going on between Bill and John in the chat bar around digital exclusion. It's something that we're certainly very focused on here, and I think the experience of the last year and a half, 2 years of COVID has really exposed the issues around digital exclusion across a whole range of different services. So yeah, it's definitely something we need to give a lot more attention to. Okay, are there any more questions before we wrap up for the evening? Conscious people have given up a chunk of their evening to us.
There was a few questions in there that I feel compelled to give the answer to, which is like safe segregated cycle lanes.
Are you talking about comparisons with European cities?
Yeah, there's questions around normalizing cycling, comparisons to Europe. How do we stop it just being like crowd warriors? Normalizing cycling, all of that stuff. Like, it's the oldest and still the best answer.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, we can't rely purely on digital solutions and new mobility services. We have to have the right infrastructure as well, which we're working on hard in Greater Manchester, putting a lot of money into, but it takes a while to build a network that says.
I think just to add that point a little bit, I think is that cultural shift, and Ali touched on a little bit on this about engaging kind of people at a young age as well. If you look at the Netherlands, when someone gets quite old, they get a bike almost as a first present, and that's the default kind of mindset that they have in terms of how they get around, and they get a second bike when they get older, when they go for work. I think we need to start considering how we change that culture in this country, that instead of getting your first car, actually you're getting your first electric bike, or I don't know, a subscription with Beryl, for example. Like how does that all tie together as that piece? How we change with the adapting lifestyle that people increasingly have now.
And I think the different forms of cycling that are now starting to become accessible to people could open it up to a wider audience. I think, Sam, you shared a clip earlier of was it a decorator or a plumber who's converted to using an e-bike instead of a van, and he finds it much easier to kind of get around town in that. So that's an interesting application for e-bikes, and certainly we're about to trial e-cargo bikes in parts of Manchester, and looking at how they might be a new way of getting families around, as well as moving goods around for small businesses. So I think there's a whole range of potential markets that might be more or less attracted to kind of different versions of micro-mobility solutions. So I think it's quite an exciting time really to see how we can attract more people out of their cars and into active modes. Okay. On that note, I don't know, Sam, I don't know if you want to bring up the Menti poll. Have you still got it accessible, just so we can see what the final feedback was from people on the call? Oh, wow, there's loads on there now. Brilliant. Gosh, there's all sorts there. Yeah, everything to kind of physical design of infrastructure and vehicles, through to signing, information, audio announcements, way bigger pavements. Yeah, staff presence. Yeah, and I think that I suppose this highlights the challenge for us as transport planners. Obviously, we've got quite a few transport planners on the call, in terms of trying to cover all of those different issues, and trying to understand the real diversity of different users and their very specific needs. But I'm hoping that this evening has given you lots of food for thought, and I think some really useful tools that Ellie gave us at the beginning, and some practical solutions that we're starting to trial, and obviously looking forward to seeing how bike hire takes off in Greater Manchester as part of that wider sustainable network. So I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much to all of our speakers tonight. Thank you to Brogan for helping us to organise the session. And thank you all for giving up your evening to join us. I hope you found that useful. And I think, Brogan, we can probably, I don't know if we can find a way of sharing the slides after the event. I'm hoping we can. But it's been a great evening. So thank you all, and hopefully see you all at a future event. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.